Okay, here we are back for part three of the history of the papacy, the good, the bad, and the ugly. Clearly, we just finished a very difficult period, that middle period, which starts with a good 200 years of really bad popes and finishes with 200 years of really bad popes, with a couple hundred years in the middle of some really great popes and some great things happening for our faith. What we're going to do now is we're going to cover the last period from really the Counter-Reformation movement in the first third of the 16th century all the way to the present day. And I think what you're going to find here is great deal does happen both in our faith and with the papacy, and it really actually leaves us in what I call a position of maturity. So by the time we get to the end of this section, I think you'll see that the papacy may have settled in to its ultimate end state, and quite a good state that is. So let's get moving. Let's start with that Counter-Reformation period. Um, that's a pretty short period, less than 100 years, but it is an important one. And you see that we don't have many popes in this period of time. So we had some pretty lengthy pontificates. We also had a couple of short ones in there, a year or two. So it's sort of a mixed bag. What you notice is the ones that I've highlighted in green, I did that for a specific reason. Those are the popes that actually reigned during the Council of Trent. The Council of Trent was an extremely long council. It wasn't contiguous over that period, but it met in several sessions, and as a result, a number of popes were involved with both running it and feeding it input, and then promulgating its outcome. So we will cover all of that. So let's give just the brief highlighted points of what was happening Christian-wise during this period, 1534 to 1623. So again, Council of Trent dominated the early portion of this. So you can see three major meeting periods: 45 to 49, 51 to 52, and then 62 to 63. This is our 19th ecumenical council out of 21. And it was called in direct response to the Protestant Revolution. So you really have to thank the Protestant reformers, Luther in particular, but certainly Calvin and Zwingli and Henry VIII, and from there, all the secondary splinters that were part of the Protestant movement, because they really did eventually wake up the church. There was certainly a lot of delay there, and too much delay, quite frankly. But they did have the desired effect. They were intending to reform the Catholic Church. And even though they went off the rails and ended up forming their own national churches, what you did do through their efforts was get a reform of the Catholic Church. So it was doctrinal and practical reform. Many of our doctrines, which had always been in place, were finally codified. And again, many of our governance and ecclesiastical practices were finally documented and put in use. So it was a real cleaning house of the Catholic Church and really straightening things out that had developed over these first 1,500 years. And strangely enough, it started with probably the most unlikeliest of the popes. So again, Pope Paul III, who no one would have thought, okay, would have been a leader of the Counter-Reformation, yet he ended up being the guy who got it rolling, and peaked with certainly one of the more formidable popes in our history, Sixtus V, who did some tremendous things. The constants of these guys were, a real key drive to concentrate the authority in the hands of the papacy. So this is a continuation of that anti-conciliar movement we talked about last time we were together, and just aggressively attacking the enemies of the church. So this is not just a punchback, but it is an aggressive punchback, and not just that Protestants, but Protestants, the Islamic Turks, who were really doing a lot of damage to Christianity, making sure that would be put to an end, and then certainly the pursuit of heretics within the faith, and those that, on the one hand are swearing that they are in communion with the Catholic Church, and on the other hand practicing a different faith altogether. So that was key during this period of time. Now, all this increase in centralized authority did have a little bit of a negative pushback, and it probably triggered more of the Protestant papal hostility than anything else, because as the Pope got more and more influential and powerful in Catholicism, at least from the outside, from the Protestant view, they saw this as, just a continuation, or feared it would be a continuation of the abuses of the past. At least the educated Protestants did. And quite frankly, it was quite the opposite. So what they're afraid of did not happen. But because they had this fear and this, growing sense of doom tied to the papacy, they actually did some pretty ridiculous things. So, for example, England waited almost 200 years before they implemented the Gregorian calendar, simply because it was developed under papal authority. And they just assumed it was going to be a disaster, even though science and mathematicians and everyone else around the world said, "Hey, this makes perfect sense. We should do this." You had Protestant countries that would actually refuse to do things because they were associated with the Catholic Church. So just a negative side effect of the Counter-Reformation and the concentration of power in the papacy. So again, starts with Paul III, and I say it, it's unlikely. Oh, and I do see a typo. Let me stop and correct that. Hold on a moment. So again, it does seem like it would be very unlikely that the Counter-Reformation would start with Paul III, because when he was elected, it looked like we were just continuing this line of Renaissance popes. If anything, we were taking a step backwards. It almost seemed as if they deliberately wanted to get back to that very corrupt period. Paul's sister was Alexander VI's last mistress. Paul was a cardinal. He himself had a mistress and 4 children, and 2 of his cardinals were actually his teenage grandsons. So you're seeing nepotism, you're seeing concubinage, you're seeing illegitimate children. It's back. And by the way, his approach to satisfying the Roman people was again, lots of entertainment, fireworks displays, balls, bullfights, horse races. He really thought that would be a good way to keep the people in Rome happy. But strangely enough, despite all this, he is one of the few bishops that, as a bishop, had actually implemented the limited but yet existent changes that came out of Lateran V. So it's interesting, as he was, on one side off the rails, on another, he was starting to become a reformer. And actually, before he became pope, in his later years as a cardinal, he actually left his mistress, finally got ordained as a priest. So he wasn't a priest ahead of that period of time. Remember, you didn't have to be a priest to be a cardinal. You don't have to be a priest to be a cardinal today, actually, in case you didn't know that, because they're just advisors to the Pope. Now, most of them are cardinals. Most cardinals are bishops, and clearly most cardinals are priests. I don't think we've had a non-ordained cardinal since the 19th century. So it's been a while, but that was more the norm, or more normal. I wouldn't say it was the norm, but more normal in past centuries. So he left his mistress, got ordained as a priest, started taking his role as a clergyman very seriously. And then he was the one who did indeed recognize it's time to call a council. And he had to do a lot of fighting to get that council called. The other cardinals didn't want to have it. Okay. And the reason they didn't want to have it is they knew they were part of the problem. And that if we were cleaning up the corruption in the church, that meant the cardinals were going to get slapped around. So Paul had some work to do. And what he did was he started stacking the College of Cardinals with scholarly reformers. So he deliberately started, taking the best of the best and putting them into the College of Cardinals to eliminate his opposition. And then he assigned a group of them to go and develop a detailed report about the problems of the church, which, of course, they came back and said, well, the problems with the church are primarily the papacy and the cardinals and the corruption that exists there. So, Paul III said, yep, okay, we got to fix this. He started actually implementing more reforms before even calling that the first session of of the Council of Trent. And interestingly enough, he is also the Pope that in 1540 approved the Jesuit order, which certainly was a huge step. The Jesuit order really reporting directly to the Pope, doing everything they can to advance the Pope's needs, came about just at the right time. So, you had Paul III to kick things off, and then you have Gregory VIII. He really was the one who had to implement everything with Trent. So Trent was done by the time Gregory VIII came along, and he really was instrumental in implementing the new seminary system to make sure we had properly formed priests and bishops. He created the Gregorian University, named after himself, of course, and leveraged the Jesuits to staff it. So the Jesuits became a major teaching order, which meant that you had a consistency in what was being taught in these Catholic universities and seminaries. And the Jesuits kind of spread out across Europe and created this consistent teaching authority. Obviously, he implemented the Gregorian calendar, which fixed a major flaw in the Julian calendar, where you would lose time each and every year. And he made the pretty bold decision to fix that lost time all in one shot. So the year 1582 is an interesting year. It's a good trivia question, a good bar bet. 1582 actually had 10 less days in it than any other year. We had to take 10 days out in order to actually realign the calendars to be accurate and aligned with the cosmos. So that was all done in 1582 under Gregory VIII. And then you had Sixtus V. So Sixtus V, even though he had a relatively short reign of 5 years, really was the big implementer, picked up where Gregory had left off, and just was ruthless in his implementation of the doctrines of Trent. So he ruled the Papal States with an iron rod. He really did a great job, depending upon your point of view, of convincing the Catholic princes and kings to throw their weights against the Reformation and support the Counter-Reformation. Did a lot with papal nuncios to make sure that he stayed in constant contact with leaders around the world. Had a major moral purge in Rome. Even attempted to do something which a lot of people would find a little bit difficult today, but he attempted to impose the death penalty for adulterers. He really wanted to make Rome the champion of morality. Again, probably the biggest thing he did is he actually reduced the power that was centralized in the College of Cardinals. And he did that by organizing them into separate groups and compartmentalizing their work. So no cardinal actually had control over that large of a swath of the operations of the church itself. So with their limited scope, they all of a sudden had limited power, limited ability to corrupt. So again, pretty powerful there. And despite all he did, he oversaw a lot of reconstruction in Rome. Despite all he did, because of his great management and style and just not accepting crap, so to speak, he left a massive surplus in the papal account. So he really finished a lot of the cleanup of the Counter-Reformation, and then left the papacy and the church in general in a great financial position, ready for a new segment of growth. Unfortunately, it didn't go swimmingly from there. So this moves us into our next section, where we start to see a deterioration again of papal power. Not so much the moral and financial, corruption that we saw in the past, or the control of the papacy by very limited special interest groups. You just saw the papacy start to fade. And in one sense, it makes sense. I think we've mentioned this a couple of times. The key to the papacy was they were the largest standing institution, or the church is the largest standing institution run by the Pope. So by default, people gave their allegiance to the church, gave their allegiance to the Pope as its leader. Whether the Pope was good or bad, they didn't even know most of the time. But they would swear their allegiance to their faith. as opposed to their nation state, because the nation states didn't exist. Well, by this time, the nation states are really coalescing. Now, so we have France, we have England, we have Spain, we have some of the lower countries now forming. Germany is pretty solidified. At this point, it's really kind of Italy is the one holdout which still has the city-state governance system. So as that happens, there's the rally around national pride, and as nation states grew in importance, the papacy and the role of the church, at least in the secular world, starting to evaporate. So again, counter-reformation started off great. We saw it really, Sixtus had taken it to a whole new level. But by the time we get into this period, we're in the 30-year war period. A lot of that encouraged by Sixtus, who was demanding that Christian princes go out and Catholic princes go out and fight against, literally fight against the Protestant revolutionaries. And at first, even in the 30-year war, which was a terrible war, things seem to be going good from the Catholic perspectives at the very beginning. Major victory at the Battle of White Mountain. Around that same time, we saw the canonization of 4 of the great Counter-Reformation saints. So, these people had all been in that Counter-Reformation period. Teresa of Avila, Ignatius of Loyola with the Jesuits, Philip Neri, and Francis Xavier. So, 4 mountains of people in our faith had been canonized now. So, things theoretically are going to be good. However, by the end of the 30-year war, things started to fall into sort of a stalemate, Catholic Protestant stalemate. And the Catholic Church accepted the Peace of Westphalia, which basically said, you know what, how about we just let everybody do what they want to do? And that really wasn't the intention. There had been constant battles physical battles between Protestants and Catholics, really going on probably close to 100 years. And the end of it was nothing. The end of it was status quo. So very unfulfilling there. And a lot of that had to do with the country of France. This is an oddity in these Protestant Catholic wars, that from time to time, France, a very Catholic country, would fight on the side of the Protestants. And the reason for this was they did not want the Catholic domination to be so complete that the Holy Roman Emperor, who was then the German Holy Roman Emperor underneath the Habsburg dynasty, would dominate Europe. So France was actually playing politics with faith at this point. And it won't be the last time that France plays politics with faith. So, an interesting little side note to how this all happened. And what ended up happening now is, the papacy is increasingly in battle with Catholic princes. Catholic princes of these emerging nation states are asserting their own authority, and too often they're butting heads with the church. And in the past, where that butting of heads would very often work out well for the church, in the New World, where we have nation state development, and all of a sudden loyalty is shifting from the faith to the secular world, it didn't work out well for the church. Okay, really, to be on the opposite side of a king or a prince, even a Catholic king or prince, was a recipe for disaster. And that's what started to happen more and more. Again, the result of that was, these secular princes kept demanding more and more power from the church, or more and more autonomy from the church. So much so to the point where there was a number of concordants were written. So a concordant is agreement between the church and a country about, who has authority on what area relative to faith and relative to secular governance and whatever. And more of these concordants were produced. And, some of them went very far. Like, the emperor, the Holy Roman Emperor, along with the kings of France and Spain, they actually, in their concordats, acquired veto rights at papal conclaves. So they were allowed to send an ambassador who could say, yeah, no, this cardinal can't be the pope. So you couldn't veto an elected pope, but you could veto a cardinal from even coming up for election. So this is a very significant ceding of power. And by the 18th century, the papacy's ability to really influence in any substantial way these evolving nation states had slipped away. And by the end of that century, the end of this period, these secular princes were really starting to dictate to the Pope, forcing changes in the church, whether it be in church practice or governance, or even what ultimately ended up being the suppression of the Jesuit order, which was formed just a couple hundred years earlier, as the Pope's army and had done great work. Where these princes started to realize maybe we'd be better off without the Jesuits, they were able to actually garner enough authority and power to have that kind of influence over the Pope and make that happen. So I'm going to take just a brief break and I'll be back and we'll go through the popes, starting with Urban. So that brings us to Urban the Eighth. Okay, so again, a military guy, strangely enough. So he, like some of his predecessors, took his role as the commander of the Papal States pretty seriously. Spent a lot of time in battle in the Papal States, trying to protect the Papal States, and outside of that, he was also pretty focused on patronizing the arts. So maybe a little step back to the Renaissance era, and beautifying Rome and things of that nature. And he actually, outside of the Papal States, really showed no interest in European politics. So his papacy, as you can see, was a pretty long one, so 21 years. And over that time, the papacy sort of withdrew from the rest of Europe, which contributed to the loss of authority in the papacy itself. It was a deliberate withdrawal. And he was focused a little bit more on the church, a little bit more on managing the landmass that he was responsible for. And he was there was some good reform occurring, but mostly that reform was occurring from lay leaders like Saint Vincent de Paul and others of his era that were bringing new apostolates to the church and really making the church a living faith. One thing, unfortunately, Urban the Eighth is famous for is he was the Pope during the Galileo affair. And if you know nothing about that, probably what you do know is probably a distorted view of the affair. But it was a little bit of ego on both sides. I would actually say a little bit more ego on Galileo's side that caused these two former good friends to actually poke at each other for quite some bit, and ultimately resulted in Galileo's house arrest. It was a good house arrest in a palace with servants, but still was a house arrest because Galileo just refused to budge on his position that his hypothesis was correct. Now, it ultimately was proven correct, but the position of the church was, okay, well, talk about it as hypothesis, not as fact, because you're actually stating something that is causing problems within the church. And he refused to do that. Okay. And most scientists today would say, well, yeah, that wouldn't have flown from a scientific perspective, but Galileo is a pretty bold guy. But there's more to it. I don't want to get into that. But he was, unfortunately, Urban got the rap for Galileo. He also really took a very hard line with the Jansenists in France. And a lot of people looked at the Jansenists as really devout, Catholics, kind of like the ultimate counter-Reformation Catholic. And people were wondering, why is this Pope, seeming to go after these hardline Catholics? Like Galileo was a pretty hardline Catholic himself. So it kind of gave him the reputation for going after people that were super orthodox, and that is not what he intended. And all of his battling and marching his armies around through the Papal States actually ended up leaving them in a little bit of chaos. So he did a little bit more damage than was good, and because of all his spending on the arts and things of that nature and beautifying Rome, um, he ended up taking all the advantages that previous popes have left from a financial management perspective and destroying them, leaving the papacy and the church coffers pretty much empty here in the middle of the 17th century. So not a good situation at all. We moved on to Innocent the 11th, number 240. He tried he tried to say, hey, I see things going in a bad direction here as we continue to succeed or cede power to these nation state princes and localized government authorities. So, he said, look, I'll be Pope, but you got to help me. I have a plan. So he actually had laid out a 14-point plan before they elected him as Pope and said, I'm only going to accept the papacy if you guys support the implementation of this. So, and they did. And so he was able to balance the papal books, which was a huge concern, eliminate the debt, build some reserves. He pushed missionary activity around the world. So, in a lot of ways, he fixed some of the things that his predecessors had just introduced. And he's most famous for convincing the King of Poland to come to the aid of the emperor in the Battle of Vienna. So, remember, Constantinople had fallen, and the emperor had fallen back to Vienna. And now the Islamic Turks were at the gates of Vienna and about to destroy it. Um, and quite frankly, had it not been for the Polish king arriving just in the nick of time and surprising the Turks, who did not guard their back, and all of a sudden they found themselves with a large army behind them. Had it not been for them, I think Christian Europe could have been in sad states, because if Vienna had fallen, that would open the gateways for the Islamic Turks to flow into the balance of Europe. So this was a big moment in Christian history. That brings us up to number 247, Benedict XIV. This guy was great too. Okay. So again, he's now restoring some of the power in a way. What it turned out that he was a great politician. He was admired by both Catholic and Protestant secular leaders. He did a lot to streamline church governance. He did a lot to, again, continue the regularization of papal revenues. He was a teacher, so he's the first to use an encyclical letter. So you hadn't seen encyclical letters. You'd seen a lot of bulls, just declarations. But now you started seeing encyclical letters, which would be circulated throughout the church as a teaching mechanism. And it was Benedict XIV here who really started that. And every pope since has continued it. So, he also recognized the reality. So as he was continuing to straighten out the church, and again, he was respected, he also realized that concordants were with them to stay, and he had to negotiate more concordants and give away more of the church's power within the secular realm across these new nation states. So even though he was wonderful and strong and everything you'd want him to be, he was also a realist, and was trying to hold on to as much freedom as possible to practice our faith in these emerging nation states, and as a result had to give up more and more to do so. And that gets us to Clement XIV. And by the time we got to Clement XIV, really the ability of the Pope to have any significant influence over these kings and princes and governments of these nation states was evaporated. As a matter of fact, he actually signed a series of concordants under pressure from the King of Spain and Portugal, France, and Austria, to dissolve the Jesuit order. And the reason for that was the Jesuit order had done a great deal to try to counterbalance the colonialism and the subjugation of indigenous peoples in the New World that was mostly being done by Spain and Portugal, France, and Austria. So they saw the Jesuit order as a thorn in their side in their colonial ambitions, and thought it would be great to get rid of them. And they kind of put enough pressure on the Pope to do this. So it was a pretty low period in the papacy, because the papacy had to collapse to that political pressure, and really disavow what was at that point a tremendous gift to the church, which was the Jesuit order. And that brings us into and preps us for this age of revolution. So a short period of time, really a 75-year period from the late 18th century into the mid 19th, covering just a few papacies here. Okay, so some pretty long lasters again, a couple 20+ year papal runs. But at this point, you're primed. You have these nation states, which up until this point had been governed almost exclusively as monarchies. And people were pressing for freedom, and this became the age of revolution. It's when our own nation was formed in this period of time. And matter of fact, our revolution became a model in some ways for the revolutions that then came in Europe, in both France and the United Kingdom or England. So, late 18th century, again, you had a situation where really the papacy was just the figurehead. That whole two powers idea is now gone. Okay. There's, a desire of complete separation of church and state. And on top of that, a recognition that of the two, only one had real authority, and that would be the state. So these concordants had done a lot of damage to that, but they're water under the bridge. We're never going to get that back. Um, and some of the secular leaders really said, hey, you know what? Religion in my country is really as much my domain as the church is. So we'll let the church handle major doctrinal issues. We'll let the church handle major heretical issues, but just management of the faith of the people really kind of should be handled within country, not by this large centralized organization called the Catholic Church. Strangely enough, because of Jansenism, and Jansenism was Jansenists were a group in France. They really started as a Dutch group, but migrated into France and dominated France for quite some time. A lot of the Jansenists, became anti-papal, partly because the popes, including the one I highlighted, had really spoken out against them. So they started pushing the supremacy of bishops. So now you have the secular leaders pushing against the power of the Pope and diminishing that. And now you have, groups within the church itself, specifically the Jansenists, who are pushing the other direction, saying we should put more power in the hands of the bishops. And because they saw a lot of what they thought were some of the remaining corruptions in the pure Catholic faith, things they saw as almost superstitious, some of the devotions and the attention paid to relics and elements of the Church of Antiquity, things like the Shroud of Turin, for example, and how much attention was paid to these artifacts. They really kind of associate that with Rome and the Pope, and said if we could just get things into the hands of the local bishops and keep our church localized, we'd be in good shape. So you're seeing a pretty big movement against the centralized church, and it all explodes in 1789 in France. And unfortunately for the Jansenists, what happened here is France went bankrupt. Okay, so France had been fighting England on and off, and other countries from time to time for now 4 or 5 centuries. And even though it had coalesced as a nation state, its management of its own finances were not great. That's why we saw earlier, the dissolution of the Templar Knights and the taking of their money. At this point, there was no one left to take money from, except perhaps the church at large. So France is going bankrupt. The populace is starving. People are looking around, and what they're looking around and seeing is we have this giant thing called the Catholic Church, where all the bishops are from the aristocratic class, and they seem to have pretty much everything. So as the people were revolting against their monarchy, they're also revolting against the church. And strangely enough, the Catholic clergy, the priests, in their local parishes and churches, kind of joined with the revolution, because they had seen, maybe it's not the bishops that need the power, maybe it's us. And so they had the priests on the side of the revolutionaries. And again, very quickly, from mid 1789 to the end of 1789, you basically had a complete change in the government of France. You still had the king in place, but the monarchy was essentially powerless. The Third Estate, the Revolutionary Guard, had formed an assembly, and one of the things they did right away was, well, let's get rid of giving any more money to the church. Let's get rid of tithes. So that was their first outright attack on the church. But just a couple of months later, they said, you know what? Why don't we also then take everything that the church owns and put it in control of this new government that we have? Because they had no money. So you have a new government that was in the same space as the monarchy was, without any money. So what did they end up doing? They took a trick out of the bag of the monarchy and said, well, let's just take someone else's. And what they did is they ended up confiscating all the church assets in the country, and selling them. Okay. And looting monasteries and religious houses and things like that that had things that had been bequeathed to them over centuries, and saw this as a great source of income. The clergy, they then decided would be actually employees of the state, and paid by the state. This is when the clergy finally woke up and said, "Wait a second, what are you doing here? You're starting to undermine the faith in general." But it was too late. The horse was out of the barn, so to speak. Again, the secular councils and this desire for a national religion kind of started to open up, and it was a national religion without God. They were looking for a religion of more humanism based approach. By 1792, they realized, well, the monarchy no longer is necessary at all. So they went a couple of years just having the monarchy in the background, not really doing anything with them, just they were powerless. This is when they finally said, let's kill the king. And that's what they did. And this is when it got really ugly in France. The clergy that were now revolting against this constitution were targets. Thousands of clergy members were attacked or killed or forced to leave France, and try to take refuge in the papal states that actually crossed into what is today modern France. So things got ugly pretty quickly, or uglier. And then by the winter of 1793, that was when Christianity was basically outlawed. They wanted a religion of mankind. Okay, so you saw the religious statues and crucifixes in Notre Dame replaced with statues of the goddess of wisdom, and the celebrations of humanity's achievements being highlighted in churches. And when you went to church, what you did was you were really worshiping humanity, and this new democratic movement and self-governance and independence, and those became the buzzwords of the revolution. And by 1796, you had a very powerful and young leader in Napoleon, a general in the Revolutionary Army. He arrives in Italy, attacks the Papal States, and his intention, as he sees it, is to free the Italian people from the Pope, or at least that's how Napoleon is playing it out. He was turned away from Rome by the Pope at the time, only after the Pope agreed to pay an enormous ransom, and hand over some of the greatest artwork that the church had collected in its first 1800 years. And the Pope was also forced to issue a letter to any remaining French Catholics that they need to obey their new government and not resist. So things had really gone from bad to worse. But strangely enough, as often is the case, when a pendulum swings, it swings back just as hard. And after a while, Napoleon started realizing that, what was happening with this new government was not sustainable, and nor was it working. They still hadn't developed any new sources of income. So without money, it's very difficult to pay for armies and things like that. So Napoleon took things in his own hands and said, you know what, we're bringing back the monarchy, and I am now the monarch. So 1804, the French Revolution is dead, and we're back to a monarchy. This time it's a monarchy under one of the former revolutionaries, which is the history of humanity. Okay, so we have Napoleon, who not only takes over the monarchy of France, but has now in his mind the whole idea of, wait a second, let's reestablish the Holy Roman Empire, and I will be the emperor of Europe. So it wasn't just France that he was after at this point. He saw a pathway to conquering all these new nation states, maybe outside of perhaps England, which with the Channel made it difficult. But his thinking was he could go both east and west, and expand his realm to essentially take over the old Western Roman Empire. And that meant he needed the Papal States because they're right in the middle. And he took them. Okay. And but as is anything, he made some mistakes. He went faster than he could support. He still didn't have the monetary backing that he needed. He hadn't put in the financial systems to support this engine of siege. He ran into some very difficult times in Russia, which basically did more damage to his armies than good. And by 1813, he was forced to abdicate himself. And and he's done. And we're back in France, back to kind of where we were before. Okay. And at this point, concordance continued to be signed. Really not just to ensure that the church had no power in the secular world, but that the secular world would have some influence on the church in their nation state. Because they did realize, that faith was one way to appease the masses. That became the rallying cry. The revolutionaries who wiped out Christianity in France learned a really terrible lesson that actually, without faith holding things together, you have a lot of different interests that raise their ugly heads. And so now all of a sudden, these same kings realize, yeah, we need to not go to state control. We do need a strong papacy, but we need to make sure we have the rules in place that the papacy doesn't step on our toes. But all of a sudden, the pendulum is swinging back for a strong pope, albeit a figurehead pope from these kings and monarchies' perspectives. Again, they wanted the appearance of strength, the appearance of a strong Catholic leadership without the results of a strong Catholic leadership. So it was a swing, but not a complete swing. So in this period, we start with Pius VI, who was just the wrong guy. Okay, a spiritual guy, a great, great religious figure. But everyone should have realized there was probably going to be a problem when all the Catholic kings that had veto power actually supported him. So he was a spiritual guy, but he was also a nepotist. So he did some damage again by bringing friends and family members in at key positions. He did do some good things, another patron of the arts and the Vatican Museum. And as a matter of fact, the rumor has it that his liturgical celebrations, because he was such a spiritual human, were so reverent that he actually was getting people to convert back to Catholicism just because of the beauty of his liturgy. So, there were some significant power, or positives there. But he was known for continuing to sign concordance. So he was really kind of like that perfect figurehead they were looking for. He looked strong, and he looked reverent, he looked papal, but he kept doing more and more, signing more and more concordance, giving more and more away from the church's perspective, and ultimately ended up dying in a weird circumstance. A French general was killed during a riot in Rome. The French march into Rome. Remember, Napoleon is here at this point in time. March into Rome and arrest the Pope and the cardinals, and the Pope ended up dying on the trip to France. Okay, so this was probably the best thing he could have done, because it kind of rallied the rest of Europe behind the Pope and against Napoleon. So there was a positive there. We'll skip ahead to Pius VII. This is our number 251st Pope. At this point, the revolt in France is over. Okay. Napoleon has become the monarch, and he is actually making moves to restore the church, recognizing, like all the other leaders of Europe, that having a strong looking faith, and a faith that the masses could rally around, is useful for actually running a country. So Napoleon actually had Pius come and crown him. People loved Pius. They came out to cheer him, and part of that was certainly what happened to the previous pope and his death in a very rude way. So that rubbed off as a positive for his successor. Napoleon did again send an army to Rome, this time not to arrest the Pope, but to make him a deal, because Napoleon, again, was intent on unifying Europe under him, and Italy was part of his intention. and he needed the papal state. So he made an offer to the Pope, and the Pope refused. So now, once again, the Pope has to be arrested. This time he was imprisoned in Italy in Savona Palace. He was forced to sign a concordat that did meet all of Napoleon's demands, including succession of the papal states. But Pius VII, as soon as he got out from underneath Napoleon's thumb and was returned to his stronghold in Rome, simply told the world that he had been forced to do this. And this ended up contributing to Napoleon's ultimate downfall, because it was one thing when Napoleon was powerful in defeating the world. It was another thing when Napoleon was trying to reach agreements with these kings, and they started to see that Napoleon couldn't be trusted, and the Pope did a great deal to undermine the trust that other people were willing to place in Napoleon. And with no one trusting you and everyone looking at you with watchful eyes, it's very difficult to rally any sort of sustained movement. And Napoleon realized that far too late. So in a way, Pius VII really hurt him. And then we get Gregory the 16th. Okay. He finishes this period of time as Pope number 254. He had a throwback view of the papacy, so more of a monarchical view, back to the two powers. And he really wanted to see things put under the Pope's thumbs. So after Napoleon's abdication, the papal states are returned in 1815. This Pope spends most of his time in the 30s and the early 40s putting down revolts in the papal states, and actually even asking outsiders like the Austrians to come in and help him. This was a disaster. It worked, but he ended up filling the Italian prisons and the papal prisons with these revolutionaries. A lot of people left Italy because the Pope had really made it very difficult there. And once people started exiting and the papal states were in chaos, the papal revenues were also in chaos. So again, the papacy falls into a period of fairly extreme debt here once again. And then that brings us to two very important popes, and another very brief period, a 50 some odd year period, but an important one. So, and it's the next two popes in succession, Pius IX and Leo XIII. So again, the French Revolution showed everyone what a weak papacy meant, and what a state-managed church would look like. No one wanted that. More Catholic thinkers were now going back to, yeah, we need a really strong pope. The idea of strong bishops kind of faded away. Clergy realized they can't be running things. So all of a sudden, everyone is becoming what's known as an ultramontanist. So someone who believes the power really needs to be heavily concentrated. Power in the church needs to be heavily concentrated in the papacy. By the time Pius took office, though, they thought he was more of a liberal guy. They thought he would help bring Italy up, and especially up on par with the rest of the world. So at this point, pretty much all the other major nation states are in place, and Italy is still a conglomeration of city-states run by individual kings. So they thought that Pius the 12th would balance his predecessor a little bit, who had imprisoned all the people looking for Italian unification. And initially it looked like Pius would fit that bill, but as soon as people started talking about him giving up the papal states, boy, did he flip and become ultra conservative, like his predecessor and predecessor before him, and an ultra Montanist. So Pius looked like an answer for a while, but as soon as push comes to shove and the papal states were threatened, he basically became super conservative. And that pressure around taking the papal states and unifying Italy did not go away. As a matter of fact, it only kept increasing. And a lot of that had to do with the period of time when Napoleon had taken the papal states and, for all intents and purposes, had unified Italy, and how well things worked. So Napoleon didn't lose because he wasn't able to make things work well. He lost because he tried to do too many things too fast with too few allies. Okay. But so people in Italy remembered what it was like to have the papal states and the rest of the city states in some sort of loose confederation. And that really made it clear that that was the appropriate long-term destiny for the Italian people. Now, the popes, on the other hand, didn't see it that way. They thought losing the papal states was a disaster. Excuse me while I take a sip. Um, they thought of the Pope as a temporal king, and if the Pope had no land, well, what possible claim to power? So, the popes and even the bishops were saying, look, we're already being forced to sign these concordants. At least we have the authority that's backed up by our position as, one of the largest landholders in Europe. Without that, how can we possibly achieve anything? So there was a real fear that without wealth, the papacy would collapse entirely, and the church would potentially collapse with it. Okay, and again, this all goes back to the 8th century, the donation of Pepin, and those papal states, which, while a boon for the church and the papacy in some periods, if you really think back on all three of these sessions, what you realize is, for the most part, the papal states did more damage than good to papal prestige and Catholicism in general. But, again, Catholics were rallying to this position of saying we do need a strong pope because a weak pope didn't work well. Okay. And the problem is that all of a sudden the result of that is people, really started getting too churchy. I like that term. It was almost suffocating. Like everything had to be ultra orthodox, ultra conservative, and the church started just refusing any sense of anything modern, as well. So you had a couple of different things happening at the same time here. And it all started with Pius IX, longest pontificate in history, 32 years. So again, he was elected to be this modernizer that may support Italian state unification. Turned out to be anything but that. Okay. He did make some pretty important shifts in Catholic thinking. Certainly was one of the first popes to make substantial movement in the area of defeating anti-Semitism and changing some of the church laws, which were heavily biased against the Jewish people. Again, he was wary of giving up control, because he did not want to lose the papal states. And as a result of that, when the city states in what is now northern Italy, got attacked by the Austrians, Pius refused to help. So Pius's perspective was like, I got to take care of my own land. You guys are on your own. And this really was a straw that broke the camel's back, because then the Italian nation or city-state leaders realized that Pius had no intention of ever seeing a unified Italy someday. And now all of a sudden the work was not just fight off the people from the outside, but it's time for us to just take the papal states, because that's the only way we're going to have our own unified nation state. Again, Pius ended up getting chased out of Rome. He could only return in 1850, because the French army came with him. Okay. So, had it not been for that, I think Italy would have been unified back then in the 1850s. But the presence of the French army continued to give the Pope the power he needed to hold on to as much of the papal states as possible, even though little pieces of them started getting picked off piece by piece. Like the French started taking the area around Avignon, which is in modern day France. So again, the papacy depended upon foreign armies for protection, and Pius started to realize this. He's in a really tough spot. He does do some important things. He's the one who declared the dogma of the Immaculate Conception in 1854. He also called the First Vatican Council in 1869, the 20th Council. And that council actually had two claims to fame. The first one most people don't know anymore, but they published a document called De Filius, which really defended the rationality of the faith. And this was important in an age when modernism and rational thought were key. People looked at the church as the governors of a massive mythology, and superstition. And what Pius IX did was disavow that through De Filius, making it clear that faith and reason are two sides of the same coin, and that there is no such thing as science without starting with the fundamental worldview of faith and a reliably predictable, repeatable order. So that was the first thing that council did, but not what's most remembered for. What it's most remembered for is declaring papal infallibility. And this had been debated forever. A lot of people said, yeah, well, it's clear that the Pope is infallible in a very limited scope when making official proclamations on faith and morals to which the Catholic faithful must assent. But a lot of the people that argued against declaring it simply said, well, that's how we operate anyway. So why do we need to declare it? Because in declaring it, we're likely going to anger some people. And they were right, but the Pope decided to declare it anyway. And at that point, the King Victor Emmanuel of Italy had really rallied power behind himself, was able to start to unify the Italian city-states. And at that point, he made an offer to the papacy and to the church hierarchy, to actually create the new Italian states and eliminate the papal states. And he did this through what he called the law of guarantees, which would have been fairly favorable for the church outside the loss of the land. But that wasn't going to happen. So the papacy left Rome again. That just opened up the door for unification of the papal states with the balance of the Italian city-states. And, eventually what you end up having is you have the declaration of Italian as its own sovereign, or Italy as its own sovereign nation shortly thereafter. So, that was it for the papal states. The Pope still felt he owned them, so when he did return to Rome, he locked himself in the Vatican, and sort of like, "I'll show you." The King of Italy said, "Feel free to stay. Okay, feel free to stay there. This is us now. We are our own country, though." And strangely enough, through this whole period of time, the church had grown quite a bit, leaps and bounds. New territories opened up, 200 new bishoprics over this extendedly long papacy. So again, there was some positives there with what was going on. Leo, he comes in, replacing Pius, and people think again, here's a strong ultra Montanist Pope, but he looks a little liberal. So maybe this is going to be a good guy. He did do a good job of restoring some of the prestige associated with the papacy by spending a lot of time with national leaders, not just to Italy, but across Europe. And at the same time, upholding doctrine. So as he's bringing this truce back with all these national leaders, he's not compromising on the faith. He was another one that championed the lack of conflict between faith and science. And even though he was a realist, he never abandoned hope of recovering Rome and the Papal States. Okay, so he had leadership discussions with the German Emperor. Okay, this would be Bismarck at the time, a name you may know. And again, tried to really do some wonderful things to kind of claw back some of the restrictions that had been placed on the church over time, specifically in Germany. And also famous for his approach to engaging in politics and the economy, when he often wrote on politics and the economy, and made it clear that the church has no preferred form of government as long as the government is for the people, and is actually putting the people as their first priority. Okay, the church's position was then and still is today, that a lot of different answers can work for the common good, with only a few that need to be fought against at all times. So socialism, communism, things of that nature. But they said outside of that, almost any mechanism could work. Again, Leo was the Pope during the period of the height of the Industrial Revolution, or at least the height of the growth of the Industrial Revolution. So he got to see a lot of evils in the world, and he responded to those evils with one of the most amazing social encyclicals ever, Rerum Novarum, in 1891. So good, as a matter of fact, that almost every pope since then has reissued it with a foreword of their own. So if you've never read it, you should check it out, because it really is focused on the Catholic obligation to the poor and the working class, and the Catholic obligation of the rich and upper classes to help the poor and urban class. So again, did a lot of other things as well. He certainly attacked not just socialism, but unrestrained capitalism. He really focused on the right for everyone to have a living wage and, some pocket change. Promoted, the study of theology, something that was a little bit of a surprise, because as an ultramontanist, usually you don't see that. But he did. He says time to open up and embrace some of the new Christian scholarship and modern critical methods of biblical exegesis. And he said, yeah, let's do that. He also opened up the Vatican archive to historians, which they'd been asking for years, so that the church, which was basically the central record keeper of Europe, could actually give some of those records back, and we could learn from them. So he did open that up, and he also, directed the church to kind of remember and go back down the path of what we had lost with St. Thomas Aquinas, because he felt the answers could all be there. At number 256, Leo the 13th. Again, Leo, we're continuing here, condemned Americanism. Americanism, which is really a focus on indifferentism and relativism. As a matter of fact, you could say Americanism is back today, because you see the same focus, especially among some of our younger people. So he condemned this, and his approach was, you know, that church teaching, and I have it written backwards here, church teaching should not adapt to the culture, but should be rooted in historical teachings. Let me correct that typo as I have a moment here. Okay, that's correct. So he denounced pluralism of religion, which is great, because we're seeing that today. As a matter of fact, if you think about it, what Leo was going through during especially towards the end of his pontificate, is kind of what we're going through today, over 120 years later. So relativism, the constancy of faith, pluralism, all religions are the same. These are things that were critical elements way back when. They're critical elements again if you look at what the church is combating here in the present day. Issued massive number of documents. So he went well beyond the standard "I'm the court of final appeal," really believed in proactive teaching from the papal chair. As a matter of fact, he became, the beginning of the long string that's continued to this day of popes that really focused on teaching and sharing and helping the world at large come to an understanding of who Jesus is and how to grow in virtue, become the best version of ourselves. So again, he really did a tremendous number of things. But if you can go back and pick one thing, I would urge you to read Rerum Novarum, simply because it's as relevant today as it was back in Leo's time. And that brings us to our last section. This is it. Okay, we will now have migrate through our last group of 11 popes or so, or 10 popes or so. Yeah, I guess it's 10 when you don't count Leo, and not 12. But if you count Leo and Pius, it's actually a group of 12, who I would argue, are a brand new papacy, with the loss of the papal states and the complete focus on church teaching and church governance, and church pastoral care. that really had not the negative effect that people thought it was going to have on papal influence, but quite the opposite, had a positive effect, as popes could now move away from the corruptions that easily seep in management of a nation state, and focus purely on the faith, purely on the lessons of Christ and the methods of Christ for sharing those lessons. So this period of time, though, of the world, even though again, the papacy seemed to have been diminished, losing its papal states and material fortunes and income source, from a spiritual perspective, it was probably the best time ever. So, and those two things are not a coincidence. We no longer have the papal states and secular governance dragging the church down, which means it's now free to pursue teaching and guidance in the areas of faith and morals. Okay. And all of a sudden, the church started to realize, especially after Leo XIII, that the church could have a great deal of influence if it maintained its moral authority. So this became obvious as well. So you didn't need land, you didn't need money. Moral authority was a currency that the papacy could use as well, and it started to recognize this. Unfortunately, 20th century, really a time of upheaval, especially that first half. We went from monarchy to liberal governments based on some form of democracy, a little bit of socialism, to a shift to the rise of dictators. Okay, so kind of had a pretty significant shift in secular governance in a very short period of time. There were two massive world wars, as I'm sure you know, which leads the church to say we got to do something. So let's open the windows of the church and let the church out, and that's what Vatican II is all about. Sexual revolution hits about the same time there, so as does the attack on traditional authority structure. So whether it be the church, the government, whatever, everybody is looked at with a shroud of, I'm not so sure. Okay. So you need to understand what was happening here. Pretty tough time, even though from a papal perspective, from a theological and spiritual leadership perspective, it was actually a pretty good time. Unfortunately, the rise of the internet and social media at the end of the 20th century, that makes things more difficult. Okay, everything that the church does is scrutinized instantly around the world, and all of a sudden, you have easy access to the truth and the non-truth through the same devices. So this caused some problems for the church and the papacy. And again, I will argue, despite all the headwinds facing the church, the world wars, the communication tools that started to bastardize truth, what I believe we have here in this period of time are the 10 best sequential popes we've ever had. So if I count Leo and discount John Paul I, that would be 10. Again, I could be tempted to add Pius in there, but I think the real transition happened with Leo. And I could add John Paul I, although he would have died within a day of his coronation. So again, great group in this period of time. So you had Pius X. He, strangely enough, was the first parish priest to be elected pope in about 20 popes. So going back a couple hundred years. Very warm guy, really organized, reconstructed, simplified canon law, improved seminary education. He was the one who started catechetical programs at the parish level instead of, in Catholic schools or instead of in Catholic homes. He created CCD programs that are the precursors to it. He tried to reform the church's prayer life, wanted to change the breviary and the missal. By the way, liturgical reform and document reform had been going on for 100 years, long before Vatican II. So everyone associates it with Vatican II, but significant liturgical reform had been happening for decades at this point. Back to receiving Holy Communion, he's often thought of as the Pope of Holy Communion because he wanted younger and younger people to receive it. So he's the one who moved the age requirement from 12 to 14 back to 7, so that younger people who were capable of understanding the truth of the real presence could start receiving it as the earliest possible time. He also was responsible for promulgating a very important canon, canon law number 329. And from this point forward, from Pius forward, bishops can only be named by the Pope. All right, so we got rid of, bishops by acclamation. We got rid of big bishops elected by secular rulers. They're just saying, no, from now on, in our church governance, a bishop can only be elected and put into place by a pope. Leads us to Pius XI, a scholar, and spent most of his professional career as a librarian, but he was an able administrator, a little bit of a hothead, known for flipping out when the people that worked for him failed miserably. You know, he was also a big believer in concordance. So while concordance served to restrict the church's power, he realized that concordance also had the effect of allowing the faithful to continue to practice the faith that they so loved. So, he did a concordant with Italy in February 1929. Trying to get the age right. Yeah, February 1929. That gave the church the Vatican City as a separate nation state, which we still hold that way today. So we have a little teeny piece of Rome, which is Vatican City, which is not part of Italy. Okay, it's its own separate nation state. And this concordant also paid the church an enormous sum of money, 1.75 billion lira, as compensation for the papal states that the unified Italy had taken in the third quarter of the 19th century. The concordant with Germany in 1933, which was actually negotiated by Pius XI's successor, was not very well received. But again, the church had a slightly different view. They knew that Nazism was evil, and to agree to anything with them would be a massive risk. But at the same time, they thought communism was worse, and they saw Nazism as sort of a barrier or a blockade against communism. Rather fight one enemy than two, I guess, is the thinking here. Again, that concordant with Germany didn't do much, though. By the mid-30s, it was clear they had no intention of allowing Catholics to practice in peace, which was major elements of the concordant. You had really a pretty big dossier of Nazi abuses, which then got resolved in a way when in 1937 the Pope wrote an encyclical, Brenda der Sorge, condemning Nazi abuses in Germany, had it smuggled into the country, duplicated and read from all pulpits there on Palm Sunday, 1937. So it was going to be a really difficult message for the Nazis to take, and they realized we probably only get one shot to do it, so we're going to do it together. And he followed it 5 days later with his encyclical Divini Redemptoris, which renounced communism. So he attacks Nazism, and then he denounces communism. May 1938, Hitler comes to Rome as the head of the German state, and Pius actually left the city when Hitler got there, and his excuse was he couldn't, bear to see an eagle, or see couldn't bear to see couldn't bear to see another cross raised in Rome that was not the cross of Christ. So when the Nazis came in on their official state visit, when Hitler came, Pius left and kind of left Hitler just standing there. And again, his rationale was couldn't see another cross raised in Rome that was not the cross of Christ. Then you get Pius XII, number 259, one of my personal favorites. Long papacy, 1939, 1958. So he'd been groomed for the role for years. He was, in various nuncio and secretary of state roles, both at the Vatican level and local within various countries. He had been the nuncio to Germany and then the secretary of state under his predecessor. So he was very, very well versed in what was happening in Germany. Also a very pious guy. Every night he would go down into the Vatican crypt and just pray amongst his predecessors. Something he did from the very beginning to the very end of his papacy till he could no longer walk. And again, he had no illusions about the goodness of Nazism. He too thought it was bad. He thought, like his predecessor, communism was worse. So if I pick between the two, I'm taking Nazism and going to try to play Nazism off of communism. So he was a realist, but he also loved the German people. He had spent so many years there that he had an affinity for the country and the culture and the people itself. His early years in the papacy, the early couple of years, were just focused on trying to avoid the war that was obviously going to happen no matter what. He's the one who coined the term, nothing is lost by peace, but everything is lost in war. And again, he tried to be that middle ground player that could foster peace. But as he more and more started recognizing some of the atrocities of Hitler, and he was able to recognize them because of a network of priests feeding him information about what was really happening in Germany. He actually, did something that most people weren't aware of until after the Vatican archives of his papacy were opened. He was actually in alignment with some of Hitler's leading generals who were going to attempt to kill Hitler. It was an assassination plot. They needed the help of the English, and these German generals actually went through the Pope to get the help of the English. And this really put a lot of strain on Pius XII because he had to question the morality of this, of basically participating in an assassination plot. But he chose to do it. He chose to do it using the concept of just war theory, and the principle of double effect. So even though he anguished over it, he did move that program forward. Okay. But he was forced to conceal it from everybody. So most of the world never knew that he did this. And we, quite frankly, may not have known had it not been clearly laid out in the Vatican archives of his papacy. He did everything he could to fight the Nazis in the real world front as well. But he had to be careful. If he comes out and directly attacks the Nazis, that's just going to result in more death of Jews and more persecution of Catholics. So he's in a really tough spot. So most of what he has to do through back channels and through methods that aren't quite as visible. And a lot of that meant spending a lot of money to help Jews escape Germany. And that's what he did. And he was, I wouldn't say content, but very successful in saving Jews, not just from Germany, but all the surrounding nation states, including Italy, where at one point about 10,000 Jews were housed in and around the Vatican site itself. So he did quite a bit. By the time we get to 1942, though, he's kind of had enough. The gloves have to come off. And he does give a Christmas address that goes after indirectly Hitler and Mussolini. They both recognized that it was an attack on them. And they then said, okay, it's time for us to kill the Pope. So from that point forward, there was an assassination plot developing, an attempt to kill the Pope. The Pope was alerted to it by some of those German generals and was able to avoid it. But that was the only time the Pope got, publicly vocal, and you can see what the result was. He almost paid with it for his life. The reality is a lot of people have a sense of what Pius XII did that was not anything like what he really did. Jewish historians, Jewish leadership, they knew what he was doing. They knew that his actions were actually saving the Jewish people to the point where Golda Meir, the first prime minister of the nation state of Israel that was created after World War II in 1948, actually put the number at 900,000 Jews having owed their life to Pius XII and the actions he took during his papacy. So that right there is a pretty good acknowledgement. Where he gets most of his negative history comes actually from a fictional play, a play by the gentleman named his name was Rolf Huckuth. The play was called The Representative. It was put on in 1963 and quickly became very popular. People would buy the play as a book. They would go see the play, and really it portrayed Pius XII as a collaborator with Hitler, when nothing could be farther from the truth. Strangely enough, as it turns out, it was very effective in convincing the world that the Pope and the Catholic Church was a moral failure during the war, which is exactly what the Hakuth had intended to do. Okay, he had actually been hired by the Romanian Secret Service at the request of the Russian government to write a play that damaged the Catholic Church, because the Russian government, being communist at the time, was looking for a way to knock out the last remnants of the church and have a reason for doing so. So again, it was a very effective strategy, because even to this day, there are Catholics that will tell you Pius XII is Hitler's Pope, and it's all because of this play by Rolf Hakuth that is the case. Towards the end of his papacy, he did get out of the war. So, he had a good 10 years, 10 to 15 years as a post-war pope, and released some really, truly monumental encyclicals during that period. Mystici Corpus on the church as a body of Christ, Divini Afflante, which opened up the Catholic study of the Bible, and allowed Catholics to more effectively leverage modern biblical critical methods, and Mediator Dei, which really called for more active participation in the liturgy. This ended up being a precursor into what happened at Vatican II with the restructure of the liturgy. And this was really the culmination of about 100 years of people calling for liturgical reforms, because the people had stopped going to mass. If they did go, they came late and left early. No one really was paying attention. Priests weren't even giving homilies because they knew no one could understand them in Latin. So it was a disaster. So Pius was addressing that with that third encyclical, trying to re-promote active participation in the liturgy and an embracing of the liturgy and the elements of it as the holy sacrifice in the Mass. Again, perhaps one of his most famous acts is publishing Humani Generis. Okay. Again, warning against a lot of the new movements in society, and compromises relative to faith, relativism itself. So that is a very powerful statement on the relationship between church and science, church and social culture, church and modern thought, against truth is truth, against relativism, against the same things that we fight today. His closing, or one of his closing acts, was certainly the first individual exercise of papal infallibility, which, if you recall, was declared at Vatican I. Pius XII was the first one to put it to good use with the declaration of Mary's Assumption in 1950. And that gets us to John the 23rd. So his successor, Pius XII had reigned for a long time, 19 years. Normally what they do after a long papacy is look for someone who's older, who likely won't last long, just to have like a little break before they pick the next guy that's going to lead them to the next, or lead us to the next big way station in our journey. So there was a deadlock vote, and again, someone then, after the deadlock vote, nominated John the 23rd. Okay, and he won. Okay, and the idea was he was older and pretty congenial, but not a guy that was perceived as aggressive in any way, shape, or form. They didn't think he would last more than a couple of years, and he didn't. Quite frankly, ended up finding out he had stomach cancer within months of being elected pope. Didn't tell anybody. So he did battle it out for 5 years, but ultimately the writing was on the wall. So from that perspective, they were right. They were having a placeholder pope. What really surprised them was this placeholder pope started doing some things early on that showed he was going to be active. And one was he made Archbishop Montini a cardinal. This is really important because Montini is now a day-to-day advisor of the Pope as a cardinal, and he ended up being his successor. So in essence, he started maneuvering to make sure he could indicate who his successor was. And we quickly realized why he wants to do this, because 3 months into his papacy, he calls a council, Vatican Council II, our 21st and last council, or last to this date. And again, with the stated idea of it's time to open the windows of the Vatican, let the church out. Our world needs it. So, this shocked everybody that he was willing to do this, especially the old guard that elected him, thinking he would just, placehold for a couple of years till his death. And that fed into Paul VI, his handpicked successor. He left off where John the 23rd left him at Vatican II. It was Paul that pushed through the completion of the council and then directed the implementation. In a very difficult time, he reigned during a period of, worldwide social upheaval, the sexual revolution, the women's rights movement, also institutional upheaval where, institutions that had for centuries been revered, whether it be government institutions or religious institutions, really any institution, all of a sudden, became something that was feared or at least doubted or something people were leery of. So again, very, very difficult there. He traveled quite a bit. Okay. He was one of the popes that traveled extensively, probably the first one in a couple hundred years that tried. But he really thought that he needed to get out and help push the implementation of Vatican II. And really drive Christian unity. He saw openings there for reunification with the East potentially, and who knows, even bringing in some of our Protestant brothers and sisters. In that regard, he was probably a little ahead of his time. It was a little too early, but he was at least willing to try. Very famous for in 1968 writing Humanae Vitae. This was the reassertion of the perpetual teaching of the church against artificial contraception. It was not received well. The group that had been studying this topic before him had recommended that he not do this and that he actually do the opposite and change church teaching, which he can't. Okay, but they wanted him to. And the result was basically a revolt of that committee. And then, as they started talking, revolt of bishops and priests around the world who were in direct conflict with this thinking, who wanted, infallible doctrine and dogma to be able to be changed. And the Pope is like, that can't happen. Okay. It's always been the teaching of the church. It will remain the teaching of the church because we've either declared it dogmatic, which means it's divinely revealed by God himself, or we've declared it infallible, which means it cannot be substantially altered in any way, shape, or form. So, the revolt that happened, though, amongst the clergy and religious was significant. Huge swaths of clergy and religious left the faith because of this document. And Paul VI himself was never really quite the same after that revolt. He really wrote nothing else for the balance. His next 10 years of the papacy kind of kept a low profile, and really was disillusioned with elements of the church hierarchy that failed to support him as he thought he should be supported with the issuance of Humanae Vitae. And then this gets us to John Paul II. Okay, the last pope we're going to cover, number 264. So we're not really going to talk about Benedict and certainly not Francis while he's alive. John Paul II, first non-Italian pope since really Hadrian VI back in 1522. So 466 years between the last non-English pope and Pope John Paul II. Huge player at Vatican II. A lot of people don't know that, but he and Benedict were both theologians who were called on to provide advice and counsel at Vatican II. And they were instrumental in the writing of many of the bigger documents there. He played a huge role in the collapse of communism. I think most people alive today know that. His push in Poland was the first brick taken out of the Great Wall. And eventually, he was the Pope that saw the collapse of the Berlin Wall, the symbolic sign of communism's influence in the Western world. So he was a hugely influential Pope on the political stage, did more to bring world religions together, especially Christians and Jews, than any other pope. Matter of fact, probably all the other popes put together. Prolific writer, a teaching pope, issued more encyclicals than any pope other than Leo the 13th, and some of the most beautiful writings in the history of our church. So, just the Pope of my youth. So I always think fondly of him. And really, he kind of mastered what Leo the 13th had learned, is that even though the papal power base of the papal states, the kingship, the secular rulership had gone, what John Paul II, pretty much all these popes realized, is that they could be moral leaders. They could influence and wield more power through back channels and moral leadership and through the membership of the body of the church than they ever could, based on some limited and really just symbolic power of the papal state. So again, John Paul II was great at that. So 1534 to today, a lot happened. The church and the papacy restored the moral order during the Counter-Reformation. Council of Trent really clarifies 1,500 years of church teaching and tightens up governance and practices. It didn't reverse all of the losses of the Reformation, of the Protestant Revolution, but it did set the stage for growth, and true faith, was brought back to the forefront. The evolution of the nation states really reduced church influence in secular affairs, and as it turns out, we now know that that was a benefit to the church. The church holding on to that secular authority that it first got when the Roman Empire started to collapse in the West, really in many cases led to many of the corruptions and problems that we've seen over the course of these three parts on the papacy. So, again, very late we realized this. Took us 1,000 years, more than 1,000 years to realize it. But we learned some really valuable lessons here. The formation of the nation states and the creation of the Italian nation was the final straw that brought us to that point. And again, really got the popes to focus on what they should be focusing on, which is moral authority. So some big turning points: 1540, the Jesuit order is recognized by the Pope. 1545 to 63, Council of Trent. 1565, Siege of Malta. We didn't talk about it. Hugely influential. This is when the Turks attempted to take Malta as a springboard into taking Europe. A ragtag bunch of aging crusader leaders actually held on there until the Spanish Armada could finally come to save them. Then there's the Battle of Lepanto. It was another, failed attempt of the Islamic Turks to invade Europe using their tremendous sea power. The Battle of Lepanto turned on a change in wind direction and a very undermanned Catholic navy that was a combination of the Navy of Venice and the Navy of Spain and the Papal Navy, defeated a much larger and much more powerful Islamic navy, and basically destroyed it. So destroyed Islamic sea power. Then you get the Gregorian calendar, 1582, the Peace of Westphalia, 1648. And then the last real big battle between Islam and Christianity for Europe, the Battle of Vienna, the last attempt, another land attempt to push into Europe one more time, that, with the help of the Pope and the Polish king, was rebelled or refuted. And that was pretty much it. This was the beginning of the end for what was known as the Ottoman Turk Empire. It took, another 100 years or a couple hundred years or so for that end to come with the end of World War I. But this was the beginning. It was the last time that the Turks attempted to destroy Christianity and overthrow the European powers. 1773, we see the suppression of the Jesuits as papal authority and power really hits a real low period. gets even lower in 1789 with the French Revolution. Although the backdraft from that with Napoleon ending up declaring himself the new monarch in France in 1804, so just 15 years later, is just showing you the failure of that revolution, failure of the rejection of the church. Ultimately, Napoleon himself falls. We end up right back where we were before. Napoleon abdicating, the Papal States get returned. But ultimately that was a short-lived return. When the Austrians invade northern Italy, 1848, the Pope doesn't act. Okay, that kind of much sealed the fate. 1850, the Pope was forced out of Rome, could only return with the help of the French army. That was symbolically a pretty important moment. The Declaration of the Immaculate Conception the same year, Vatican I, 1869, Declaration of the Papal Infallibility, the Franco-Prussian War, which basically ended Vatican I, as the French had to exit Rome to go fight this war, leaving Victor Emmanuel in charge of what was now the unified Italian state, and the end of the final blow and end of the Papal States. We have Leo the 13th, 1878. Just want to, mention him as he was such a powerful pope. Rerum Novarum, 1891. His great social encyclical that has been rewritten and reissued by most of the popes since him. The Italian Concordant, 1924, the establishment of the Vatican States. The German Concordant, 1933. The secret preaching on Palm Sunday, Mi Brenda der Sorge, 1937. The famous Hitler state visit to the Vatican where the Pope left him there alone, 1938. Vatican II announced, 1958. Vatican II proceeds, 62 to 65. The play, The Representative, which, misrepresented Pius XII's role in World War II, Humana Vitae, 1968, and John Paul II, 1978. So quite a active period, 1534 to today. So bottom line, okay, from the three parts that we've covered, clear, the papacy and the church was established by Christ. The papacy both shaped Western civilization and was in turn shaped by it. Hopefully you can see that the history of Christianity, the history of the papacy, and the history of the Western world are so tightly integrated, to attempt to separate them would be impossible. The papacy evolved from the humble beginnings as a source of spiritual leadership for an emerging religious movement, to really for centuries being at the center of world power in one way or another, either as a puppet or as a leader, before arriving where it stands today as the visible center of Christian unity and really the moral center of Christian unity, and perhaps where it should have been all along. So it took a long and winding road to get here, but I think it may have gotten to where it needs to be. The men, the 266 or 267, depending upon how you count, that have sat on the chair of Peter have been both saints and sinners, clearly. Yet, despite their motives, they demonstrated that Christ's promise comes true. He promised that the gates of hell would not prevail against his church, and the Holy Spirit would guide it to all truth. So despite the fact that there are some tremendous scoundrels sitting on the chair of Peter from time to time, and you've seen a lot of them over the course of this series, those two promises by Christ have prevailed. So, I'll finish off just with my list, because people had said, hey, give us your list of the best and the worst. So here's my list of the best. And you can see it spans from Damasus, Pope 37, all the way to John Paul II, Pope number 264, with, another 12 guys in between. And all of them played a major role in either restoring the church or establishing, something good for Western civilization at a time when it needed it most. All of them were holy men, major players, all of them sinners as well, but all men dedicated to fulfilling the role as Christ prime minister on earth. And then here's the worst, from Vigilus, number 59, really to Clement the 14th, number 249, with a great honorable mention of every single one of the 40 popes between 1872 and 1057 being amongst the worst. So the worst list is much larger. because we've had a lot of bad ones, and it just goes to prove that the Holy Spirit was active in making sure that these bad ones did not destroy Christ's church. Your list, your longest serving, so Pius the Ninth, almost 32 years. John Paul II, 26 years and a half. And down to Urban the Eighth, finishing out the top 10 at 20 years. And the shortest serving, well, Urban the Seventh, 13 days. Okay, so 13 days, not much. And even going down all the way to number 10, it was a tie between Benedict V and John Paul I, who both reigned only 33 days. So we've had a lot of very short papacies over these 2,000 years. And then most common names, John by far the most common name, 23 popes chose John. You could actually say 24 if you count the anti-pope who chose John. Benedict 16, Gregory 16, Clement 14, Leo 13, Innocent 12, Pius 12, Stephen 9, Urban 8, and Alexander's the only other one chosen multiple times like that at 7. So again, those are my lists of lists, and this is our selected biography for those of you that want to dig a little bit deeper. All of these books are and short courses are instrumental if you really want to dig. I wouldn't recommend any of them over any others other than if you're looking for a starting point. Eamon Duffy's Satan's Sinners is great. John O'Malley's work is also great. So is Thomas Noble's. And then if you're looking for a real deep dive into papal supremacy and papal primacy, you can't go wrong with Eric Ibarra, the last book on the list there, The Papacy, revisiting the debate between Catholic and Orthodox. So hopefully you enjoyed the 3 videos in this series. They're a little bit longer than the live sessions will be or would have been. So hopefully you found these interesting. I had a chance, at least in the video, to go a little bit longer, so I took advantage of that opportunity and gave you a little more detail. If you watched this live or if you heard it live, hopefully this provided you some supplemental materials and really helped to solidify some of the core messages in your mind. And I thank you for watching, and I look forward to seeing you next time at Elevate. Take care now.